What initially appeared to be a single tragic use of force incident in Minneapolis has since unfolded into one of the most consequential federal investigations the region has seen in decades, exposing a criminal network embedded far deeper than anyone publicly acknowledged at the time. The story began during a federal immigration enforcement operation when an ICE agent discharged his weapon following a confrontation involving a vehicle, resulting in the death of a 37-year-old woman. Within hours, video of the incident spread rapidly, igniting protests, political reactions, and a fierce public debate over use of force, sanctuary policies, and accountability. Federal authorities maintained the agent acted in self-defense, asserting that his life was endangered during the encounter, a claim echoed publicly by Vice President J.D. Vance, who pushed back against early narratives portraying the shooting as an unprovoked act. Yet while public attention fixated on the shooting itself, federal investigators were already looking beyond it, because that single gunshot did not conclude the operation. It detonated something far larger. Quietly, in the early hours before dawn, unmarked federal vehicles converged on a 14-story hotel in South Minneapolis, near a major interstate artery, executing a meticulously planned raid that would alter the trajectory of the investigation entirely. By 3:12 a.m., exits were sealed, elevators locked, and armed teams moved floor by floor through darkened corridors, breaching doors, and ordering occupants to the ground as agents cleared rooms with military precision. In under an hour, more than 200 undocumented individuals were detained, nearly 180 of them Somali nationals, but the scope of the discovery quickly exceeded immigration enforcement. Agents uncovered forged passports, prepaid burner phones, and concealed cash. Then something far more alarming. Dozens of firearms, including loaded pistols and assault-style rifles, alongside cocaine and fentanyl packaged for large-scale distribution. Cash totals surpassed $4 million. What had begun as a routine enforcement action instantly escalated into the exposure of an armed narcotics distribution hub operating openly within city limits. As dawn approached, seized phones continued vibrating with encrypted messages and missed calls, prompting DEA analysts to begin mapping connections in real time. Patterns emerged rapidly, pointing toward centralized coordination rather than fragmented street-level crime. Names surfaced that stunned investigators, not because they were unfamiliar, but because of who they were. Individuals with legal authority, professional credibility, and institutional access. According to emerging evidence, the operation had functioned for years behind a shield of legitimacy, exploiting legal systems, political influence, and systemic blind spots to move drugs, weapons, and people across state lines. Surveillance soon indicated flight risk. By mid-morning, two central figures arrived separately at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, carrying minimal luggage and one-way international tickets. Federal agents intercepted them before boarding, making swift arrests that stripped the network of its protective core. From there, the investigation expanded at a scale rarely seen, triggering synchronized raids across 6 states as more than 1,000 federal agents executed warrants with coordinated precision. What followed were armed confrontations, firefights, seizures of massive drug stockpiles, and the arrest of hundreds of suspects tied to trafficking, enforcement, money laundering, and smuggling operations. As evidence accumulated, so did the realization that the network's longevity had not depended on secrecy alone, but on corruption within institutions meant to stop it. Interrogations, financial records, and digital forensics revealed law enforcement officials, municipal employees, and legal intermediaries who had quietly enabled the operation through bribes, advance warnings, and deliberate inaction. Arrests soon extended beyond traffickers to include police officers and senior officials, unraveling public trust and forcing federal oversight of entire departments. The human cost became impossible to ignore as analysts linked the network's expansion to spikes in overdose deaths, violent crime, and community destabilization across the Midwest. What this investigation ultimately revealed was not just the anatomy of a criminal enterprise, but how easily systems erode when authority goes unquestioned and oversight weakens. By the time federal pressure dismantled the operation, the damage was already etched into neighborhoods, families, and institutions. Yet once internal protections collapsed, the network disintegrated rapidly, proving that accountability, when applied without exception, still works. What began with a single shot became a reckoning, not only for those who built the network, but for the systems that allowed it to thrive in plain sight. As the six-state operation unfolded, federal analysts began assembling the full timeline of how the network embedded itself so deeply without triggering alarms for nearly a decade. And what emerged was a methodical, disciplined system designed not just to move narcotics, but to outpace oversight at every level. Financial ledgers reconstructed from seized servers showed shipments originating in Mexico and Colombia, concealed within legitimate commercial freight, crossing the border before being routed through distribution nodes centered in Minneapolis, where the network exploited the city's infrastructure, transportation access, and institutional vulnerabilities. From there, drugs moved outward in carefully staggered waves, feeding secondary hubs across Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, and Michigan, ensuring that no single seizure could disrupt overall flow. The volume stunned even veteran agents, with conservative estimates placing hundreds of tons of cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl into circulation, each substance serving a distinct purpose within the organization's profit and control strategy. Fentanyl in particular proved devastating, leaking into counterfeit pills and accelerating overdose deaths in counties that had previously reported minimal opioid fatalities, while methamphetamine fueled long-term dependency and destabilized entire neighborhoods. Violence followed predictably, not randomly, as turf enforcement escalated into targeted shootings, armed robberies, and executions that had previously been misclassified as isolated gang incidents. Investigators later linked at least 24 homicides directly to disputes managed by the network, reframing years of unsolved cases in a single context. Witness testimony revealed how undocumented migrants were absorbed into the operation almost immediately upon arrival, burdened with fabricated debts, coerced through threats against family members abroad, and assigned roles ranging from drivers to armed stash house guards. Cooperation was enforced not through loyalty, but fear, and attempts to exit were met with swift retaliation. What allowed the operation to persist was not just intimidation, but structure. Routes rotated frequently, vehicles were abandoned and replaced, communication platforms shifted constantly, and when pressure mounted in one corridor, shipments rerouted overnight. Local agencies, working in isolation and often compromised, never saw the full picture until the hotel raid collapsed the network's compartmentalization. As agents mapped the damage, one conclusion hardened across internal briefings. The destruction was not accidental. The overdose spikes, the violence, the community decay were foreseeable outcomes of a machine optimized for profit, regardless of casualties. Tens of thousands of lives, directly or indirectly, had been affected by the drugs moved through this single organization. For years, the network operated in plain sight, shielded by legal credentials, professional titles, and institutional complacency, while neighborhoods paid the price in silence. When the scale finally became undeniable, the investigation pivoted inward, confronting the uncomfortable reality that enforcement failures were not solely the result of limited resources, but of corruption that had normalized itself through routine. Interrogations revealed consistent patterns: payments exchanged for ignored traffic stops, advance warnings of raids, manipulated filing dates, and redirected patrols that left corridors exposed by design. Internal affairs units moved quietly alongside federal prosecutors, issuing sealed subpoenas and executing searches that expanded daily. By week's end, multiple officers had been arrested, followed by revelations implicating senior leadership, including a sitting police chief accused of accepting payments to suppress investigations and redirect manpower. Archived emails and internal communications showed deliberate interference dressed up as administrative error, eroding public trust almost overnight. Protests reignited, no longer focused solely on enforcement actions, but on the realization that criminals had worn badges and issued orders. Financial audits widened the scope further, exposing municipal officials, shell contracts, and consultants who funneled clients directly into the network. Prosecutors began referring to the structure not as a conspiracy, but as an ecosystem, an environment where corruption thrived because it blended into procedure and habit. The consequences were immediate and severe. Departments placed under federal oversight, convictions flagged for review, careers collapsing under indictments, and an institutional reckoning that proved harder to confront than armed resistance. Yet dismantling the internal shield achieved what gunfire alone could not: Without protection, routes failed, payments stopped, alliances fractured, and the illusion of immunity evaporated. Accountability, once restored, proved decisive. As weeks passed, Minneapolis itself began to change. Overdose admissions dropped sharply, street-level distribution collapsed, and neighborhoods once dominated by open trafficking fell unnervingly quiet. Prosecutors filed hundreds of indictments spanning narcotics trafficking, weapons violations, racketeering, human smuggling, and corruption, some designated as national security cases fast-tracked through federal courts. Assets were frozen, properties seized, professional licenses suspended, and public reputations erased in days. Families stepped forward with testimonies of loss, addiction, and fear, transforming statistics into human consequence. Federal officials were blunt in their assessment. This was not a victory, but a warning of how quickly organized crime can entrench itself when oversight weakens and authority goes unquestioned. What began with a single gunshot had unraveled a decade-long assault on public safety, forcing institutions to confront how close they came to failure, and leaving behind a lesson that accountability delayed becomes damage multiplied. As the final warrants were served and evidence trucks rolled out of Minneapolis under gray morning skies, something unfamiliar settled over the city. Not relief, not celebration, but a silence heavy enough to force reflection, the kind that follows realization rather than victory. For years, danger had moved quietly through courtrooms, neighborhoods, and highways, hidden behind paperwork, credentials, and routine decisions no one thought to question. And what the investigation ultimately exposed was not merely a criminal organization, but how close an entire civic system came to failing without ever recognizing the warning signs. Institutions, investigators concluded, do not collapse all at once. They erode incrementally, through ignored alerts, delayed files, compromised judgments, and the gradual normalization of shortcuts that serve convenience over accountability. This network did not rely solely on violence or secrecy. It relied on trust, on the assumption that authority figures did not require scrutiny, that official processes were inherently clean, and that silence was safer than confrontation, and that assumption became its most powerful shield. The lesson that emerged was uncomfortable, but unavoidable. Corruption rarely announces itself. It wears familiarity. It hides behind legal language, professional reputations, and closed-door meetings justified as procedure. And when oversight weakens, power stops serving the public and begins protecting itself. By the time the damage becomes visible, communities are already paying the price through addiction, violence, displacement, and lives lost quietly without headlines. This case shattered the myth that crime exists only at society's margins, because here it sat behind desks, signed documents, issued rulings, and redirected patrols, and the most destructive actors were not those holding weapons, but those opening doors, delaying consequences, and silencing questions. Law enforcement can confront armed threats, but what nearly defeated the system was betrayal from within. Yet embedded within the collapse was another truth that could not be ignored. Once the internal shield was removed, the entire structure failed rapidly. Routes closed, protection vanished, payments stopped, and accountability, applied without exception, worked exactly as intended. Oversight restored momentum, transparency became a deterrent, and while the city did not heal overnight and never fully will, the system began defending itself again. The warning now extends far beyond Minneapolis. Justice cannot be outsourced to uniforms, titles, or reputations. It depends on vigilance, on refusing to treat silence as normal, and on questioning authority when facts no longer align. When citizens disengage, corruption gains room to breathe, and when scrutiny fades, criminal power grows comfortable. This story does not end with arrests or indictments. It ends with responsibility. Because the next network will not look exactly like this one. It never does. But the conditions that allow it to grow are always the same. Whether those conditions return depends not on enforcement alone, but on whether institutions choose accountability over comfort, whether oversight remains active rather than reactive, and whether the public understands that democracy, like justice, only functions when watched closely enough to prevent silence from becoming its greatest vulnerability. What followed in the weeks after was not a clean resolution, but a reckoning that stretched into every corner of civic life. Because once the scale of the exposure became public, the question shifted from how the network operated to how it was allowed to operate for so long without interruption. Investigators, auditors, and oversight bodies began tracing not just criminal transactions, but moments where intervention could have happened and didn't. Reports that stalled, tips that went unpursued, irregularities dismissed as clerical noise rather than warning signals. Each missed opportunity told the same story. Systems designed to protect the public had grown comfortable relying on assumptions instead of verification. The danger was not that people acted with malicious intent at every step, but that too many chose inaction because action was inconvenient, politically risky, or disruptive to routine. That quiet tolerance created space for abuse to thrive. In public hearings that followed, officials spoke carefully, emphasizing reforms, task forces, and new protocols. But beneath the language was an unspoken acknowledgement that trust had been stretched beyond what blind faith could sustain. Communities demanded answers not just about what happened, but about what would change to prevent repetition. Survivors of addiction, families of overdose victims, and residents of neighborhoods hollowed out by years of violence did not want assurances. They wanted structural guarantees. Federal monitors outlined new layers of review, mandatory cross-agency audits, and real-time data sharing meant to prevent isolation of information that had once protected wrongdoing. But even those measures came with a warning. Safeguards only work if they are used consistently and without favoritism. Accountability cannot be episodic, triggered only by crisis. It must be routine, unglamorous, and relentless. The most sobering conclusion reached by investigators was that the network did not represent an anomaly, but a stress test the system barely survived. It revealed how quickly legality can be weaponized when oversight weakens, how easily authority can be repurposed when no one is watching closely enough, and how devastating the consequences become when silence replaces scrutiny. The collapse of this operation was not the end of a problem, but the interruption of one, and whether it remains interrupted will depend on decisions made long after headlines fade. The true measure of justice will not be the number of arrests, but whether complacency is treated as a threat equal to corruption itself, because history shows that the most dangerous failures rarely come from open defiance of the law, but from quiet neglect of it.